The internet is filled with all sorts of tips on how to take better photos with your iPhone. And we often focus on what's in the viewfinder. And well, that's important. There's an entire section of camera settings that most people forget about that can help you with composition, macro, file formats, and more. Let's explore that today. Hey there, Aaron here from techphotoguy.com, and today we're going to dive into those iPhone camera settings that most people don't even think about. If you're into mobile photography, be sure to subscribe to my channel because this is something that comes up frequently and I've got more to share. So let's talk about it. Most of the camera settings that we think about are in the camera app. We talk about switching into night mode. We talk about changing which camera lens we're using, whether we're going to the telephoto or the super wide angle or things like that. But these settings are in an entirely different place. They are within the settings app within your iPhone. And so that's where we're going to go today. So you're going to get the most out of this video if you grab your iPhone and play along at home. I've got mine right here. So go ahead and open up that settings app. And let's give you a little quick bonus tip before we even get into the camera settings. When you go into the settings app, if you're trying to find a setting, if you swipe down, you'll see that a search screen appears right at the top of your settings app, and that will let you search for a setting. So if you're not sure where something is hidden in the menus, you can always search the setting app. So you can search for the camera settings, or from this main settings screen, you can just scroll down. It's, a ways down. Eventually you get to a section where it has music, TV, photos, and then camera. We're looking for camera. Go ahead and tap into those camera settings. So I'm not going to go through every single one here, but there are a bunch to go through, and let's talk about the ones that really matter. The first one right at the top is the format setting. And this got a lot of play a few years ago when Apple changed the default file format for iPhone photos. It switched it from JPEG to HEIC, which is a high efficiency image format. It's a higher level of compression. It's a lossy format, just like JPEG, but it gives you better compression and keeps a good quality file size. And so when you go into formats, you're going to see that you have two options: high efficiency or most compatible. And high efficiency is the HEIC. That's the high efficiency compressed file format. That's the one that I use. I think that's the one that's on by default. Unless you have a particular reason to switch to most compatible, which will save the images as JPEGs, I would recommend you stick with HEIC. Now, when Apple made this change a few years ago, not every photo app supported HEIC files, and sometimes you'd run into compatibility issues. But at this point, it's been several years, and the reality is that all mainstream photo applications, Mac, PC, etc., should support HEIC files by default. But if you want to shoot JPEG, that's where you can do it. This is also the screen where you can choose whether or not to enable the option to shoot in Apple's ProRAW format. This controls whether or not the ProRAW settings, the ProRAW toggle, is available in your camera app. If you don't ever want to shoot RAW, you can disable it here and not have to worry about it. I don't normally shoot in ProRAW, but I have it enabled in case I want to do it. So let's back out of that format screen and let's dive into the next thing that I think we should take a look at, which is preserve settings. It's down there below a couple video settings, but if you go into preserve settings, it brings up another submenu that you can see. And this is a series of toggles that allows you to choose whether the iPhone remembers the camera setting that you used last for each one of these particular settings, or if it switches back to a default when you go back into the camera app fresh. So this includes a number of different things. I'm not going to give you recommendations because a lot of it depends on your shooting style, but camera mode is, whether it opens to photo or video or, panorama. I leave mine turned off here. I default to photo because that's what I do most in the camera app. You can turn on creative controls. So if you use a filter or a particular aspect ratio, maybe you shoot all your images in square format because you're into that retro old school Instagram circa, 2007 feel or something. So if you want to go square Instagram format 100% all the time, this is where you can tell your iPhone to keep that as the default. You can set an exposure adjustment and lock that in. You can have it preserve the night mode setting rather than go back to the default. You can change whether it's shooting in RAW or not. So the first setting that we had on the last screen was to enable RAW. This one basically says, if I enable RAW and I've chosen RAW, keep that on as my default setting. This is also where you can tell it whether or not you want it to go back to the default with live photo. This is one I definitely have turned on because I almost never want to create a live photo. And so when I turn it off, I want it to stay off. So if we go back out to the settings screen, let's dive into the next section. If you like to take high-speed burst photos, pay attention to that next setting there of use the volume up button for burst, because that will let you press and hold the volume up button to take those burst photos, which can be a nice hardware control, a little easier than the press and swipe on the shutter button, which is the default for the iPhone. The next section is about composition, and within that composition section, I really want to pay attention to that first one, that grid, because the composition grid does turn on the grid lines on a viewfinder, but there's also something here that a lot of people don't know, which is that it also gives you a crosshair, a little cross symbol. If you're trying to photograph something looking straight down, or I guess you'd be holding the phone this way, looking straight down, you can see in this screenshot here, right at the center of the frame, there's a little crosshair, and as you get the phone leveled, those will line up to let you know that the phone is parallel to the ground. It uses the accelerometer in the phone and helps it, give you a good, stable, correct picture if you're trying to shoot straight down. You can also go here into these settings, and if you scroll down to the next section, there's the photographic styles. Now, this is where you can change the defaults for how the camera captures things like color, level of saturation, sharpening, things like that. Every camera manufacturer makes choices around kind of what is the look and feel of their camera by default, and Apple is no different. Apple's photos traditionally have defaulted to a fairly straightforward, not particularly enhanced look. Whereas, if we look at, for example, Samsung's default camera settings on most of their Android phones, they tend to go for a little bit more contrasty, a little bit more vibrant pop look. Some people like different things. This is where you can change those defaults. So if that's something you're interested in, check out the photographic styles settings here. If you continue to scroll down, I want to highlight a couple more things. One is lens correction, which if you're using, the modern cameras in your iPhone, especially the one on the front, the FaceTime camera, and the ultra wide angle, if you have, a camera with that, this will apply a little bit of lens correction so you don't get quite as much lens distortion at the edge of your field of view. And then the last one I wanted to call attention to is the macro control setting. If you have an iPhone 13 Pro that has those macro settings built in, this gives you the option to show a manual control in your camera app to control whether the iPhone goes into macro mode. By default, and the only way that you could do it for the first couple months of iOS when it was released, was that the camera would automatically switch to macro mode as you got close to a subject. Apple now gives you the ability to override that automatic switching using a control. This is where you enable it. So again, these settings are not the kind of things that you're going to change frequently, certainly not as much as you're going to use your camera app. But if you care about making photos with your iPhone, it doesn't hurt to check in here every couple of months and see if there's a setting, a default that maybe has changed as your photographic tastes have changed. So if this was interesting, if you want to know more, iPhone camera tips, especially stuff out of the ordinary, again, be sure to subscribe to the channel down below so that you get the next updates coming at you. And until next time, take care.